I want to welcome you to today's edition of the Bradley Hall Show. And I am your host, the Bradley Hall. All right, hi. As you've guessed it by now, I am the Bradley Hall. I wanted you to know that I am a certified trauma recovery coach and a certified mindfulness instructor and a certified holistic life coach. Now, what this means is that I am a trauma-informed holistic life coach with a focus on awareness, which is the first step to any type of personal growth. Let my 30 years of coaching and my experience overcoming trauma work for you. To work with me, go to my website, thebradleyhall.com. Look for the coaching tab in the upper right-hand corner. You can choose holistic life coaching or trauma recovery coaching. Anyone who ever accomplished anything had a great coach or a great mentor. You should too. You're worth it. Contact me now. Hi, welcome back to today's edition of the Bradley Hall Show. My guest today is another old friend of mine. His name is Christopher Abert. Christopher is the founder and director of the Southwest Recovery Alliance. It is a comprehensive harm reduction and disease prevention program. He has over 15 years of professional experience collaborating with people living with HIV, HCV, people who use drugs, survivors of domestic violence, at-risk youth, and people experiencing poverty and homelessness. He is a national harm reduction consultant and trainer, offering technical assistance and guidance to assist communities in building functional capacity to improve the health outcomes of people who use drugs. He presents information on the public health benefits of harm reduction and is passionate about centering the needs of at-risk populations while utilizing research-based, compassionate approaches to drug use and disease prevention. And Christopher has joined us today, and we're going to discuss what brought his past history, what brought him to be so passionate about this, and go into detail about the work he does and how that parlays into someone you may know. So please please join me to welcome Christopher. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Brad. Glad to be here.
Yeah, good. I'm glad that you're here. I've really been looking forward to this conversation since we started talking about it. And I want to give a shout out to Dave Ireland, who's the one that suggested that we get together. So I've read your bio to the listeners, and it's pretty unique bio. Very impressed. And I want to kind of simplify for the listeners that we're here to talk about. Addiction, right? I know that's overly simplified.
I mean it's important. I think there is a distinction between addiction and substance use disorder, and it's maybe a good place to start talking about why I would prefer calling it substance use disorder to addiction.
Okay.
The main reason is that when I'm talking and I say, oh, addiction this or addiction that, that is very personal to people. So what I mean when I say that might be something very different than what you mean when you say that. Whereas if we use a technical term like substance use disorder, I know exactly what I mean and you know exactly what I mean. So there's a diagnostic manual that therapists and providers use to help understand, what people are suffering from, and it has very clear criteria for what substance use disorder is. So I think it just takes a lot of the guesswork out of it, and the word addiction and the word addict has a lot of negative connotations. Particularly over the last 40 years with the drug war, this is night after night of putting people who use drugs on television and vilifying them, and we'll talk about that too. Maybe the history of how we got to the stigmatization and criminalization where we are now. But in general, what I'm going to talk about is substance use disorder. more particularly severe substance use disorder, which is on the more extreme end of the spectrum, and has more of the criteria. And sometimes I just refer to it as chaotic drug use.
Okay.
That just seems like a nice lay term.
Okay.
To
Okay.
talk about it. So yeah,
And,
I'm here to talk about chaotic drug use and responses to it.
okay. And we'll get into, if you don't mind, I'd like to a little later get into exactly the chaotic substance abuse and kind of just because people are going to be just like me. I think I know about this, but in our volley back and forth, I began to really, I mean, I knew I didn't know as much as I should know or could know, but in our volley, I began to really understand that I don't know hardly anything about it. And I would like to think that I know a little bit more about it than most people. So, we're really going to have to educate people today. And I'd like to go into that a little deeper. Um, I'd like to ask you, I know that, can I read, do you mind if I read the statement that you gave me in the email about your personal story?
Sure, that's fine.
I found it very profound, and I want people to understand where you're coming from. We had talked about sharing your story, and you had said, and I'm quoting here, I'm a little leery of only talking about my personal experience because SUD is complicated, and what worked for me will not likely work for others. My personal experience is anecdotal and good fodder for a story. I would be happy to share it, but I'm not sure it'd be very helpful to others who are suffering or watching loved ones suffer. There are so many dying and confused and at a loss for how to move forward when someone they know is caught in the grips of addiction. It feels like it would be a shame not to answer those questions. That, my friend, is poetic. Very poetic. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I wanted to read that word for word. People to know, I think that clearly demonstrates where your heart is at in all of this. And I really wanted to start here because I do want you to share your story, but I want people to know that we're sharing your story because you have a story to tell. And we talked about that a little bit before we started recording, about identifying our trauma and moving forward. And I think that's a key piece. One of the things in my podcast that I focus on is awareness. Awareness is always the key to the next level, right? If we're not aware, we can't level up. Not that there are other things involved, but despite whatever tools you use, it has to be used in conjunction with awareness, or it's doomed to fail. So I want you to share your story, if you don't mind, and then we'll move from there. But I wanted people to understand where you're coming from with this. This is very personal to you, isn't it?
It is personal. I guess what I'm doing in general is harm reduction, and I hope that from what you just read and the tone, really all I want is to be in a position to be helpful, if I can at all, and to not leave people abandoned to suffer and to die. And unfortunately, again, because of the stigma and the criminalization, people who use drugs are often left in that position. I was trying to think of, outside of people who are experiencing homelessness, I couldn't think of another group of people who we just actively hate on, right? Who just, again, if I bring up, a heroin user, it's like, oh, we should just lock them all up. We should take their kids away. We should make sure that they don't have jobs. We should, and I was thinking about it, and I thought the only other population that's treated that badly and villainized that much is like ISIS.
Yeah.
Where we can just be like, we should kill them, literally, like go
Yeah.
out and get them out of our society. So I think the story starts there. The reason that I'm doing the work that I'm doing right now, because really what I'm doing is providing medical services to people when I'm doing harm reduction. I operate a needle exchange. We give out naloxone, which is the opioid overdose reversal drug. We try to test people for Hep C, HIV. We just try to keep people healthy, alive, and connected. And because the system is set up the way it is, it falls on people who are using drugs to take care of each other. So because of this constant vilification, we're not able to access hospitals. We're not able to be honest with our families and loved ones about what's happening with us. We're not able to tell the institutions that should help us what's actually going on with us out of fear for punishment. So the way I got into this was for about 20 years, I was an IV drug user. And that doesn't mean necessarily that I was in chaotic drug use that whole time. It started, I started using drugs when I was about 11. And I actually, I think one of the first drugs I took was LSD. And I look back now and I think, who sold me LSD when I was 11? But I look at 11-year-olds right now in my life and I think there's never an instance where that person, an 11-year-old, should be taking any drug. Then again, that type of drug.
No.
And what was going on in my life, right? Where I was A, had access, and B, a willingness, and C, the freedom or lack of supervision to do that.
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting. The vast majority of people who have severe substance use disorder or live in chaotic drug use, whatever you want to call it, have high ACE scores. Are you familiar with the ACE scores?
Yeah, actually, after we're done talking today, I'm going to schedule a podcast with someone talking about ACE scores. So
good.
Yeah.
Good. For the audience, the ACE score is the adverse childhood experience. And these don't have to be the most horrific experiences. Clearly, being in a village where genocide took place is going to be one of those. But it started, they were researching health outcomes. And when they were researching those outcomes, they saw similarities in people's histories when they had negative health outcomes. So years and years later, and millions of dollars, 30 years of studies, it's thoroughly researched. There's been a connection established between your adverse childhood experience score and the likelihood of being a sexual predator, I should say perpetrator, being a sexual perpetrator, being someone who perpetrates domestic violence, being someone who uses drugs, illicit drugs, being someone who commits suicide. And they showed a correlation, a very strong correlation. So for example, a person that scores a 6 or higher on their ACE is 4,600% more likely to be an IV drug user.
Wow.
And if you go to the doctor and the doctor says, Brad, you're 3 times as likely to develop cancer if you keep doing this, you're gonna be like, oh man, I gotta stop doing this. That's crazy, right? Then again, 46 times. So I don't want to argue with people about the personal responsibility involved with people who use drugs. But if I'm 46 times more likely to become an IV drug user, it's almost a done deal, right? If I didn't become an IV drug user, it would have been remarkable, and luck, right? It wouldn't have been by my own good, my own doing.
Yeah.
So when I took the ACE score, I scored an 8. And that, obviously put me in that percentile that's going to be much more likely. Well, it spelled out a lot. It helped me understand a lot of what happened in my life. So I started using drugs at this young age. I was taken advantage of by teachers, by neighbors, both sexually and physically abused by them. I was bullied to a point. I was bullied. We'll just say that. And I used to kind of downplay all that stuff. I was like, well, it's not like he penetrated me,
Which is a natural response.
I know. Or, one of them was a female neighbor. And I was like, well, it was a female neighbor, and
Right.
It was, we didn't have coitus, it was all foreplay stuff. It's just,
Right.
The point is that and I'll use the word predator, but these predators saw somebody that was vulnerable and took advantage of them for their own sexual gratification, right? The point is that when I should have been able to go to help for teachers, instead teachers were sending me passes to get me called down so that the students that were there could have free reign beating the shit out of me. So clearly I didn't feel safe. I was removed from my home by family for neglect when I was 2. I kept running away and acting out. Then I found drugs. I didn't have a lot of friends. When I found drugs, finally, I finally had those friends and I had some connection. And again, some of those people, right? And
Yeah,
we were
well,
like,
that's how you and I came together.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So I had a reason. I had like connection for the first time in my life. That feeling of like alienation and something seriously wrong with me. I wouldn't, the reason I'm getting treated like this is because there's something wrong with me. So I'm carrying all this shame.
right.
We could do a whole podcast about why we should be
Shame.
carrying
Oh, yeah.
shame, right? And
Yeah.
shame is a huge part of all of this. So the neglect.
Self-perpetuating. I don't think people understand that the shame is self-perpetuating. No matter what's happened to us, whether I talk about the trauma that I've sustained in my life. Some of it was self-created. I've made a lot of horrible decisions that have negatively affected my life. But what people don't understand, when you come from a place of trauma and the shame is so prevalent, that it doesn't matter if someone does something to you or you do something to yourself, which I'm sure you're going to get into this. It perpetuates the shame, and the shame gets heavier. And the heavier the shame gets, the more likely you are to make an adverse decision that's going to further negatively affect your life and can continue the shame. And it builds and builds and builds.
It does, yeah. And there is a certain point. Of course, there's personal responsibility in all of
Absolutely.
our lives, right? And I'm never going to deny that. There's also well-researched documentation that if I live in trauma and I'm living in chaos, I develop certain skills to survive that. Okay.
That's right.
So then when I'm removed from that environment, all of a sudden, all of my life skills are no longer useful. And I'm at a loss of what to do. And oftentimes people will recreate drama and chaos because they've learned how to do their whole life.
Yeah. It's neural pathways. It's reinforcing the behaviors that we have. It's just like, and the example I use all the time is tying our shoes. We tie our shoes every morning, and you don't think about tying your shoes. We just tie our shoes. It's normal behavior. It's what we do. Every time you put on your shoes, you naturally, instinctively just tie them without thinking. It's become ingrained in your behavior. It's a very simple analogy, but it's the same thing in all types of behavior in our interaction with our relationships, and in particularly in our relationships with other people, because all of this in a great way always boils down to the connection or lack of connection, and how we interact with certain people based on our previous on our childhood and our previous uh, interactions. So I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh no, that's okay. I mean, I was thinking like basically, I could sum it up then. I learned how to tie my shoes together, right?
Yeah.
Like,
I like that.
and that's just like what how I operated in the world. But when I found drugs, I found meaning and purpose, and I found escape. I used to make up this fantasy land. I used to go home to my mom and tell her about all the friends I had, and none of it was true, right? This girlfriend I just had this whole fantasy world. And then when I started doing drugs, I actually had friends. I had people that wanted to like smoke pot and break into the neighbor's garage and steal some booze. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, we got caught breaking into the neighbor's garage, and I ended up at juvenile. So that was my introduction to the carceral system.
Yeah.
And I remember this this experience. So I got beat up when I was there. Like a lot of bad things happened when I was there, but the most poignant thing that happened, I was 14. I was very late bloomer too, so I was incredibly ashamed of my body. I got teased a lot for that, for being very small and prepubescent. But they had me in a room, male and female correctional officers. They stripped me down and they started spraying me with delousing, and they had me like turn around and spread my and I just remember feeling so alone. Like my family couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
These teachers were fucking with me. These adults and neighbors, my peers, and now the state. Right? This is what the state does for me. The state throws me into a cage. And I'd had some involvement before. We had DCS called because of neglect when I was a little bit older, when I first moved to Indiana. So I had a DCS caseworker and a therapist, and that was a good. But in general, I just didn't feel like I could trust people. And I was in and out of juvenile. I ended up dropping out of school. And when we start looking at my ACE score, all of this is almost predicted. I'm not going to finish school. I'm going to have trouble with the law. I'm going to have, sexual not difficulties, but problems around sex. I'm more likely to start using drugs. And all of it just started happening. So I was in and out. I started using IV drugs with another classmate. A lot of my class ended up working at strip clubs and becoming IV drug users pretty soon, even while they were still in school. So when I was 17, I started using IV drugs. I had done acid. I had been in and out of rehab, in and out of juvenile. I moved back to New York, and I lived on the streets there, lived in like some homeless shelters and like a transitional housing for teens. Anyway, I came back. I tried to join the military, and this was I'm old, so the Reagan was still the president. But there were a lot of cutbacks, and they weren't taking people that didn't graduate high school. So I tried to. They told me though, if I got a certain amount of college credits, that I scored really high on my ASVAB. And they said if I got college credits, that I could come in and be an officer if I wanted to go to officer school, or pick whatever I wanted to out of those careers. And so I went, and I found I loved school. I scored really high on my GED. I got a lot of grants to be able to go first to IUPUI and then transfer down to IU, the main campus down in Bloomington. And I just loved it. I loved learning. And I thought, well, I don't want to join the military. I wanted to join the military to get out of what I was in, which was like, busting my ass working 50 hours a week at Little Caesars, getting fucked up with my friends. So yeah, I ended up going down there, and my drug use actually curtailed a lot. And this is another thing that people don't think about when they're talking about substance use. They usually think like it's a straight line, right? Of like experimental use to chaos, but actually it's not. It can be all over the place, and it can be all over the place with depending on what drug it is, at what point in my life, in what form it is, what setting I'm in. So when I go down to IU Bloomington, binge drinking is the norm there. Right. So I put down the needle, and I put down the heavier drugs, and I was taking mushrooms and drinking with my friends, smoking weed. And that worked for a while. But unfortunately, I just have built a little different than most of them. Most of them were able to put that down and move on in their life. After about 4 years, I was dismissed I would get straight A's and then just stop going to class. So I was dismissed for academic, for not passing my classes, and I went right back to it.
You said 4 years. You did 4 years there.
I did 4 years, yeah, but I don't have a degree. I was close, yeah.
Okay.
And I shouldn't have even been there. I needed more support. I was able to handle it academically, but I didn't have any time in my life where I was, this is when you study, and this is how you regiment a schedule, and this is how you make sure that you're responsible and doing the things that you need to do to show up. And I just didn't have those skills. Luckily today I have those skills and I utilize them. So things again, because they go back and forth on the spectrum, they quickly devolved. And within a few years, I desperately wanted to stop using drugs, and it never occurred to me that I wouldn't be able to. I'd seen all my friends, they put it down. They did the same drugs I did, sometimes in the same way, the same amount, and they just put them down. And then they became lawyers, and they put them down, and they went to work for the CDC, or they put them down, did all these things. And I just never assumed that I wouldn't be able to. So long story short, I struggled for about 5 years, in and out of psych wards and detoxes and mental hospitals, just trying to get a grip on this thing, and I just couldn't. And again, well, I'm not going to go into detail about like how I am not, in chaotic drug use. I will say that one part was I needed a non-judgmental community that I could connect with.
Yeah.
And so the beginning of that story is like, I didn't have those connections in my life. I barely even thought I was a human being. And the end of the story is like, I feel fully connected. I have a vibrant community that I'm a part of. I have multiple vibrant communities that I'm a part of. And at the end of the day, what I'm trying to do with the work that I'm doing is build community for people who are using drugs, so that they can start to experience that connection and start to make small positive changes in their lives.
Yeah, and I love the word connection. I'd like to hit on that for a second, because in the psychological community, the understanding is that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety; it's connection.
Right. Yeah. There's a Johann Hari TED talk and a book that he does, Chasing the Dragon, where he talks about that. He talks about a lot of our drug policy was based on some studies that a person did with rats in a cage with cocaine. And they've done follow-up studies since then that if you have a rat in a cage with cocaine and water and that's it, well, I mean, I don't think you have to be a rat to be like, yeah, probably go for the cocaine. But if you created a cage that had other rats and wheels and different avenues for adventure and connection and engagement in life, those studies showed that that the rats would do the cocaine or not, but it didn't become problematic.
Yeah.
And we have little instances of that in our history. If we look at like when Vietnam veterans came back from the war, you know, they had such a high prevalence of heroin use, what you would say is heroin addiction. And yet when they came back, the vast majority of them just moved on in their lives and didn't re-engage with using heroin.
Yeah,
and
fascinating.
Yeah, one of the theories on that is because they had something to come back to. They had families to come back to. They had, you know, there were good middle class jobs. There was a sense of community, and maybe part of the reason we're in the situation where we are with, you know, almost 80,000 overdose deaths last year, is because of that lack of opportunity for real community, for real connection, for being able to be vulnerable, for like you said, not floundering around, but being aware of our emotions, being mindful of who we are, how we're operating in the world, how we connect with others.
Absolutely. And I think there's a correlation. There has to be a correlation between the rise of technology and the statistic that we're talking about. And it seems to just be getting worse. And I know there's a lot of other factors, so I don't want to just blame technology. But my point with the technology is that we're more connected now than we've ever been, but we're less personally connected than we've ever been. You know, we'll text each other. We'll be in the same house and text someone that's in another room rather than talking with them. And you know, families watching TV while they're eating, and I mean, just the list goes on. And so every day we get further and further from that human connection, which is the rat in the cage syndrome that you're talking about. And I think that's anyway, I won't beat that to death.
No, 100%. So in Iceland, they started programs. They want to keep kids off drugs. So a couple thoughts here. One way to keep kids off drugs is to create worlds where we don't have as many adverse childhood experiences, right? So bring that down. If you want to talk about prevention of drug use, let's talk about prevention of trauma. Let's talk about prevention of untreated mental illnesses.
Not only with technology, but the coping skills we're not teaching. I was never taught coping skills. I only reacted to my environment, and I emulated the adults in my life who were mentally unhealthy because of their adverse childhood experiences, and who they were simply emotionally reacting with no awareness whatsoever. And so the changes that I've made in my life, my recovery really began about 15 years ago, and it's all been through awareness and particularly planning out who I wanted to be. But more importantly, I was insatiable about learning coping mechanisms and how to handle certain things, how to look at them differently. And meditation has been a big part of it. And you know, there's affirmations. There's so many different things, but we're not teaching these skills to children. We're not teaching them how to handle being bullied, to understand that a bully is probably bullying you because he feels shitty about himself. And you need to understand not to forgive that person, but to have enough compassion to not take it as personally as you took it, and be able to work yourself out from that ground and self-soothe. And we don't develop those mechanisms. So we get into high school and everyone is fighting for their emotional life, and all they're doing is trampling all over each other. And
with no idea that they're fighting for their emotions. Right?
No,
you wouldn't be able to articulate that at all.
Absolutely. And the only way to make ourselves feel better is through competition, because school is nothing but competition with your grades and your sports. And so the more you can trample people, the better you're going to feel about yourself. And people are just slamming into each other and just doing all this damage. And then we get out and we're adults and we're like, well, now what?
We'll compete more, Brad. I mean, we're going to compete more. I got to have a little bigger house than Brad. I got to have a little bit nicer car. I got to have.
And if you don't, you suck ass, and you should do drugs and make yourself feel better. And that's anecdotal.
No, it's your fault too, right? We
right.
live in a supposed meritocracy where the more work you put in, the more you'll get out of it. And
you're lazy, and you don't care, and you're stupid, and you'd rather do drugs and neglect your kids.
And that's why it's okay to hate homeless people the way that they're hated, right? Because it's their fault. And if I look at a homeless person, I say, actually, maybe that isn't their fault. Maybe maybe it was one accident and their insurance ran out and they went through their savings in 3 months, which any of us could do, and now they can't get back. But if I honestly look at their humanity, then I realize, wait, I'm at risk for that too. There's this false sense of security in it when I'm like, oh, I worked really hard. I put myself in this position to be safe.
That's right.
And they didn't. So I don't owe them anything. I don't even owe them any compassion. They just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps.
That's exactly right. Because if you are at risk and you have a difference of opinion, if you look down on those people, not realizing you are at risk, if someone doesn't teach you that you're at risk, and then something happens and you suddenly find yourself in that predicament, now the shame sets in. That
they
told me that I'm better than this. I'm smart. I should have been a doctor. I should have been a movie star. I should have been president. And now I'm not. And now I just got fired from a job. My wife let me, whatever the case may be, and the shame becomes perpetual.
Yeah, I've been listening to a lot of Audible books lately when I'm walking my dog. And one of the things that they said was that, we try to validate ourselves externally through achievements, through attributes that we have. And really what we should do is just have authentic emotions, be able to experience and articulate authentic emotions. And I had to rewind that, I'm not even kidding, 6 or 7 times because it's so far out of my league. What does that even mean? How do I do that? How am I able to get through all the layers and layers and layers of shame and hiding and trying to not be hurt to actually experience just authentic emotions? And it seems so simple. I can't do it alone. I can't do it without that community and that connection.
Yeah. I don't think people. So I'm a mindfulness instructor, right? And this goes back to that awareness. And I'm a mindfulness instructor, and I still catch myself, my thoughts racing, and I still catch myself and say my thoughts are racing. I need for them to stop racing, and then I catch myself 2 minutes later doing it again. And oftentimes it's always comparison of someone else's car, what someone else has done, the worst is what I was supposed to do, where I should be, what I've accomplished so far in my life is not near where I could have been had I not done this, that whole guilt and shame. And those thoughts, to go back to your authentic emotions, those thoughts aren't real. And I know that's a hard concept for people to understand, but they're simply manufactured. They become real by the energy we put behind them. All right. So, Henry Ford building, whoever created the first automobile, right? That was a concept. That was a thought. It wasn't real. And it wasn't until someone put the energy, the time, the energy, and the resources behind it to create the first automobile that the automobile actually became real. Before that, it was just a thought. And we have millions of them all day long that don't matter. But we choose the ones we want to put energy into, and we want to believe. And these are the ones, the competition we're talking about, the comparison, which ultimately, a lot of times, especially with people with adverse childhood experiences, often we never measure up, right? Never.
I mean, literally, right? I was tiny.
Yeah. But we're never good enough. Right? Yeah. It doesn't matter what we accomplish. There's that battle that there's always something else. Mm-hmm. And being able to recognize that through awareness, be able to recognize that and step away from it, not necessarily make it go away. I think people have this misunderstanding that it's going to go away and one day everything's going to be better. It doesn't really go away as much as we choose not to invest our energy back into it and have the awareness to make the decisions to begin to not run from it, not hide from it, not make excuses, not act out, whatever, but to sit with that and to examine it, see what it feels like. And that's where the authentic emotions begin to come in and understand, why do I feel this way? Why am I upset that person said that to me? Why am I upset this person looked at me, or whatever the case may be?
And typically for me, when I'm very upset, it has nothing to do with my girlfriend today, right? It has everything to do with something that happened in my childhood. So
Sure.
again, having that awareness to be like, I'm really triggered right now. It has nothing to do with the situation right now that I'm in presently.
Yeah.
It's this old thorn that's inside me, that's covered again in layer and layer and layer of supposed protection that becomes a prison for me.
Yeah.
When you were talking earlier, I was thinking about, so there's a couple of books I've been reading. One is called The Untethered Soul. Another is, I'm listening to Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now again. And a guy named Sam Harris, who does a really wonderful podcast. And he also has a Waking Up meditation app. But the idea with all of these three, like, come together with this idea that I'm not my thoughts and my emotions. My thoughts arise just the same as a noise in the environment would arise, and they'll pass as long as I don't grab onto them, as you said, and like nurture them and ruminate. So my job, for me, experiencing emotions and thoughts authentically, is to drop back. There's a point of sitting where I can observe those non-judgmentally, and I'm no longer caught up and prey to them. And if I can remember to do that throughout the day, to drop back as the observer, right? And I am not this synonymous with my thoughts and emotions. Again, non-judgmentally see them and then move forward. And on top of that, to do the work with the past about those experiences that are being triggered and work through those. I've done like EMDR, a lot of like open chair therapy and things like that to work through those things so that I can experience those emotions, right? So rather than hiding from it and putting on more and more layers and covering up the thorn, I just stop and I just experience the emotion. And emotions don't last that long if we're not ruminating and judging and beating ourselves up.
That's right.
I heard someone say the other day, like, if somebody else, if you talk to me the way I talk to myself, we would have some serious problems.
Yeah.
I would never allow you to talk to me the way I talk to myself.
That's right.
And so why do I allow me to continue to talk to me like that? Again, that's I'm also, I know I'm listening to a lot of books right now, but there's a book called The Burden of Shame by Bradshaw that really delves into all of the shame that we carry around, stemming back to the religions we're brought up in, and on and on and on. Well, all these fictions we live in about who we should be and how we don't measure up. But I think that's, to bring it back to substance use. I think that is the crux of the problem. Is I didn't know how to do any of that, and drugs allowed me to continue to operate in the world without all of that pain and anguish. I wasn't able to like cover it. I was covering it up with drugs, right?
Right.
And I think that's where things get really confusing. So let's say that you're a therapist and I show up at your office and I've got track marks and I'm nodding out. Oftentimes the therapist will say, "You've got to stop using drugs. I cannot have you showing up like this, and we're not going to get anywhere until you stop using drugs." And what they don't understand, I wouldn't have shown up to the office if I wasn't using drugs, right? I am 100% certain that I would have committed suicide years ago if it hadn't been for drugs. Like, drugs saved my life, literally. And then they didn't, right? And then they turned on me. And then everything that they gave me, they took away and just left me this empty shell of a human being. But they were essential. So that's the kind of attitude I think is much more helpful if somebody in your life is using drugs chaotically, is understanding, A, they are resilient because they've made it this far. B, they're using the drugs for a reason. Oftentimes they don't know where the ambivalence lies. But if I can have an honest conversation with them, we can do really simple things to find out, to let them discover on their own what that ambivalence is. And then they can start to get an idea of why they're actually using the drugs. And then when that happens, we can be like, how can we replace, whatever it is that's that whatever role that drugs are filling, what can we do maybe for a healthier replacement that you can engage in, rather than just like, you've got to stop using drugs. Again, for me personally, I knew I had to stop using drugs, right? It was on my agenda, Brad. I'd wake up in the morning, I'd be like, don't do drugs anymore. This is not working. And yet there I would be like later on using the drugs again, with no idea why. I just had no idea about any of the things that I know today. And I don't even know if knowing right away would have been helpful. You know, things are revealed as I can handle them.
Right.
But I do know that if I would have had someone to talk to in a non-judgmental, non-coercive, honest way, that we could have started working through some of those ambivalences, and I could have seen some of the contradictions that I had in my thinking. And you know, I got hepatitis C pretty early on. I think from the first time I injected drugs, I got hepatitis C, which is a chronic and deadly disease that affects the liver. It's actually the #1 infectious killer in the country.
Wow,
and people don't
know that.
Yeah, it kills more people than the next 63 infectious diseases combined. And people don't know it because it primarily affects IV drug users.
Yeah.
So something as simple as like, I could have avoided getting hepatitis C. So many of my friends could have avoided fatal overdose. You know, I think about, we have quite a few, it seems like an inordinate amount of common friends who've either committed suicide or had fatal drug overdoses.
Yeah.
And
well,
every
and
person
this
I
is
know
unrelated, but I want to throw in teenage pregnancies as well.
Sure.
In that small community, the suicides, the overdoses, and the teenage pregnancies are abnormally disproportionate.
And I don't know if there's a vortex in Speedway that makes it that way. But it was nonetheless, and I couldn't help but notice, like, the people that I know that ended up succumbing to suicide, you know, they were all using drugs, and they were using drugs, from everything I could tell, problematically. So again, I think those two things are very, very much interrelated.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
I like how you explained the process that just a few minutes ago when you went through what you would do. I think people need to understand that what you do. So and I'm going to use this term very carefully, right? So I have my own adverse childhood experiences that are pretty severe and pretty traumatic, and I have my own form of recovery. But substance abuse was not one of my problems. So I want to be very clear about that. But I know in my situation, and I've talked to enough people who have overcome alcoholism and drug abuse, that in my situation, it seems that, and you're the expert, so I want you to weigh in on this, that we know that just telling someone to stop, like interventions only work to a point, because if the abuser doesn't want to stop, they won't stop. And which leads me to the point through this process that you're talking about, that the user has to go through an internal process to reach a point of no return, to reach that rock bottom point where they have an epiphany, where a moment of clarity. But they have to go through that process. And it sounds like that your job through the human connection is to help accelerate that process, to get them to see a reason to live, to understand why they're behaving the way they are, the things that are going on, to the information that they may glean over, I'm just going to make up a number, but over a 10-year period, that they can do rather quickly with you over a couple years or a couple months, whatever the case may be. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I'd say it's fair. I just really quickly, though, I want to throw out there that even if somebody never decides to stop using drugs problematically, we can still do things, right, that are good for them and for us, like make sure they don't get HIV, Hep C, make sure they don't die. Because it's, even though other people who use drugs, this whole public health is public, right? So if we can, even if someone has no inkling at all to have any kind of change like that in their lives, it's still good to make sure that they don't get diseases, to make sure that they're connected, make sure that they're housed, that they're employable. But what you described and what I was describing, it's not just, it's not like armchair, it's not an armchair thing at all. It's motivational interviewing. is a really important part of this. There's this thing called trans-theoretical models of behavior change, and it's about 30 years of research, 150,000 research participants, and millions of dollars has gone into it. And basically what they're saying is kind of what you said. The change has to be internally motivated. So if I want long-lasting behavioral change, I have to want long-lasting behavioral change. What we tend to do with people who use drugs is use coercive and punishing methods. And that doesn't work. Not only doesn't it work because it goes against human nature, and human nature is that long-lasting change has to be internally motivated, and I have to come to my own conclusions usually to do that. But it also goes against everything that I was talking about with the criteria for substance use disorder. So of the 11 criteria, 9 of them have to do with the person using against their will, right? So they want to stop, but they can't, or using despite negative consequences. So if you have a disorder that's marked by using against their will, right, or despite negative consequences, what logical world does it make sense to give them more negative consequences? Do you know? Why would you use punishment for something that is defined by the fact that punishment doesn't work? And there's a long answer to that question that we're not going to have time for today, but it goes back to the roots of most of our drug policy, which is that it was being used to control certain communities. And it was never actually meant to stop drug use. It was meant to control those communities, starting with the Chinese, moving through Mexican immigrants and into the African American. If we look at the way the crack epidemic was handled compared to the way the opioid, it's wildly different, right? And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why that is.
And we don't have time to get into this, and I would love to kind of set the stage here and have another conversation about this, but just some terms to throw out, because I know a little bit about this. You probably know way more than I do. The broken window policy, for example. The broken window. Are you familiar with the broken window theory?
Of course.
Yeah.
It was a major New York policing initiative that said if you took care of the small things and really enforce those, that you would have less violent crime. That it would kind of go up the chain.
If you arrested a criminal for breaking a window, then he would be less likely to, because of the punishment, he would be less likely to commit a crime in the future. We see now that popped up in what, the late 70s, early 80s, was part of the right in time for the crack epidemic that we saw in the late 80s, early 90s. And since then we're incarcerating 1 million people a year on drug arrests.
87% of those drug arrests are for simple possession.
That's
just for having the drug. So we have more people in prison now than any country in the history of the earth. There are more people behind bars than there were in Stalinist Russia, right? You and I grew up at the same time. Like, Stalinist Russia was the most repressive regime that ever existed. And yet here we are proclaiming to be the land of the free, with more people incarcerated than the worst totalitarian regime that's ever existed. And that doesn't even count 2 times that amount are on some kind of surveillance outside of the carceral system, right? So whether that's ankle bracelets or probation. So it's massive. It's interesting. 2.2 million people are employed by the prison industrial complex.
Yeah, that's what I was getting ready to talk about, the for-profit prisons.
Not even for profit, not even just regular prisons. So if you have 2.2 million people who are dependent on a system for their survival, it doesn't have to be a profit thing. It's just like, how many rural communities depend on the prison in their county, right, to live? How many companies, like I think it's Mark and what's his name, the game show host, Bob Barker, actually owns and produces like clothes and soap. The Bob Barker Company.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, interesting, right?
Yeah, very, very, very interesting.
So there's a lot of moneyed interest.
A lot of moneyed interest, and when you take into consideration the broken window policy, the prison industrial complex, and the for-profit prisons, I mean, that should not be overlooked.
Yes.
You have people actually making money off incarcerating poor people. There's a lot to be said about that. with the rumors of the CIA involvement in the drug distribution through, in particular through the 80s and 90s with the crack epidemic, we begin to see a picture that's more than just a war on drugs. It seems to be a war on poverty.
Yeah, let me throw out one instance that's not that's thoroughly documented. There was a guy named John Ehrlichman in the Nixon administration, and in the late '90s, he was being interviewed, and the interviewer asked him about the war on drugs, and he basically said, "Wait, you're asking me, did we know that it wasn't about the drugs? Of course we did." Right? The Nixon administration had two enemies. The enemies were the Black Power movement and the hippie movement, the anti-war, anti-Vietnam movement. And Ehrlichman said they couldn't make it illegal to have long hair or be black, but they could make their common pleasure illegal. So again, they made drugs, they vilified people who use drugs night after night. And he says this in the quote: "Night after night, we got on the news and vilified them and people that look like them and their leaders." And I think it's safe to say that there's not a very good anti-war movement in the world today, given how many wars we're in and how long we've been in those wars. And the Black community was decimated, right? That the increase in the number of incarcerated people was mostly taken on by the Black community.
Yeah, and cause level after generation after generation of intergenerational trauma within that community.
Yeah, you want to talk about creating new ACE scores?
Absolutely.
Was your parent incarcerated is one of those questions.
Right.
So yeah, we are, which is one of the reasons that I'm so vehemently against using the criminal justice system to address substance use disorder. If we look anywhere else, any other Western country in the world, they very rarely do it the way we do. If you want a good counterexample, you'll go to Portugal, where they decriminalized everything about 10 years ago, which sounds insane. You can't just decriminalize everything. Well, they did. And they went from having the highest HIV rates to among the lowest, having the highest overdose rates to among the lowest. Not only did they decriminalize, but they took the money that was going into the criminal justice system and put it into, they call it, I think it's actualizing or activation programs. So they're social programs. So let's say that you're a mechanic and you're using drugs and things get out of control. They would pay a garage half of your salary to hire you and get you reintegrated into society, even if you continue to use drugs, right?
Wow.
And it worked. So we have examples like Portugal, but that would take such a huge overhaul of our system. And the common sense that we have right now with the war on drugs and the attitude. Because that 40 years of the war on drugs and all the propaganda isn't just going to go away, right? You can just snap your fingers and be like, hey, we lied. People who use drugs are actually okay. And you don't have to vilify them and incarcerate them. They could be your neighbor, and you should let them volunteer at your church.
Yeah. Well, ironically, we've seen with the legalization of marijuana, we've seen an about turn and no one asks any questions. Everybody's like, oh, okay. I don't understand why people aren't looking at the fact that we've been lied to by the federal government for 70, 80 years about the effects of marijuana. And that now suddenly we have doctors prescribing. We went from you'll go insane and all these other problems to locking people up for years. And now the doctors are prescribing. That should be the first clue that the government's that they're lying to us. We need to be smarter than them. We need to look beyond it. The costs, I would imagine Portugal's costs, I'd love to see the numbers, but I know that here it's almost $1 trillion that it costs the United States government annually to treat substance abuse when you take in tobacco, alcohol, illicit drugs, the opioid crisis, that it costs taxpayers almost $1 trillion with the way we do it now.
Yeah, and it's totally ineffective. Again, so this drug war has been happening for 40 years, and we had more drug overdose deaths than ever in history, right? HIV, again, the hepatitis C epidemic that's happening across the country, that it's a silent killer that nobody even talks about, mass incarceration. All of these things have failed miserably. So what my friend Dan Big used to say, he's so good. He'd be like, let's just set that down for a minute. You know what I mean? Let's just we've tried that. We gave it a good shot. Let's just put that down and try something different. Yeah. And the good thing is almost everything that I've shared today with listeners and with you has peer-reviewed research. I'm not talking about like data that some treatment center came up with or a business came up. I mean, research that's been looked at by other experts and vetted. So we know we can decrease fatal overdose. We know we can increase social interaction. We know we can decrease the transmission of disease by 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 installing programs like they're doing in Portugal, by doing more harm reduction, like what Southwest Recovery Alliance, my organization now, is doing, by following the lead of countries like Denmark and Amsterdam and having safe consumption sites. Interestingly, I'll just really quick side note on these safe consumption sites. Oftentimes, more conservative people were like, well, that's just some crazy, like, left-wing, bleeding heart liberal thing. The first safe consumption site was opened up by the banks in Frankfurt. And they did it because they were at their wits' end about people injecting drugs outside of the bank. And they were like, I can't do a German accent, right? But they were like, we're just going to get them a room, right? Get a room already. So they got them a room, and then they started noticing these huge benefits. Like, people weren't dying. They obviously were not in the public place injecting their drugs anymore. People were more engaged. They were more likely to seek treatment. They were easier to house. They had access to social services that they didn't have access to before. And it's not a crazy idea, you know. Like, anyone who's ever been to a bar has been to a safe consumption site. Right. Anyone who's ever like had a designated driver, that's harm reduction. I'm going to get drunk, right? You know, I'm going to get drunk, so I'm just going to take these precautions. So we're just extending that to all drugs.
I like that analogy, and I can tell you that from my experience, my personal experience, that being able to accept certain things without the shame involved is necessary for your rehabilitation.
Yeah.
With my recovery, being able to look in the mirror and understand certain things about my behavior without that judgment that we were talking about earlier. And it seems to me that safe consumption sites actually lend credence to that. You said that they're more likely to seek treatment. So now they're not doing it in a dark alley, worried about who's around and what's going on, and that underbelly, that shame that comes along with it. Now they remove the shame, and they're in a safer spot, and it's a little more accepted. I don't want to really use the term accepted, but you just take that negative aspect out of it, then they can really look at themselves and say, okay, so I don't feel that dirty anymore from this. What else can I do to maybe improve my life and not?
That's it right there. So again, we make this small positive change, and then people can build on that to do the next positive change.
Yeah.
When what we're asking them to do right now is go from chaotic drug use to total abstinence.
Yeah.
Right. Which again is impossible.
So, you know, I'm a trauma recovery coach and mindfulness instructor, and I actually work with college students, graduate students as well. And the human nature is to see the big picture and look beyond what's in front of us, and we easily become overwhelmed. And one of the biggest analogies is people with education, right? If you it's hard to look at, if you want to become a doctor or a lawyer or something like that, to look at. I've heard so many people say, I can't do 8 years of school and then blah, blah, blah. And the trick is to compartmentalize, to break that down, right? If you need to go to the top of a staircase, you don't just jump to the top of the staircase. You have to take the step right in front of you. And once you're up on that step, let's worry about the next step. And I use that approach a lot with my students. And I think that analogy works here, you know, with looking at sobriety. I know people who said, I can't do it. I know someone who killed himself because he didn't want to go back to rehab. He'd been in and out of rehab. He was going back that morning, and he killed himself before he ever got there because he was tired. He couldn't do it anymore. And it's that next step. It's the small thing that you were talking about. And and everyone I've worked with, when I break it down that way, it takes the pressure off of an outcome. Right? It's enjoying, it's tackling this, it's focusing your energy here. Let's build upon this, and it takes all that away. And the pressure exacerbates the problem. if someone's tried to quit doing taking some type of a substance several times, and you're like, hey, all you gotta do is get sober. They've already tried that. It's not that approach isn't working, which is I think what you were just saying. So let me.
Whereas if I can say, look, I know that you've been struggling, and I know this that you've tried before, and I know you're not in a position right now to quit. Why don't we get you to, why don't we have you use clean syringes? Why don't we make sure that you have someone there with you? Why don't you just stay in touch with me so that you have someone, one person at least that you can honestly talk to and not like fear retaliation?
Yeah.
Why don't we get you housed? Why don't we allow therapists to work with you even though you're continuing to drug use? Why don't we make sure that you have access to food and employment? And again, once you have a criminal record, it's really hard to get any of those things. You're kind of permanently branded. So I also thought too, while you were saying that, so this is just for me personally, I tend to look at the big picture and I'm like, with this system that is set up, we have a system that is designed to fail people. And if I stay on that systems level, big picture too long, I will be burnt out and give up because I'm just one person, one voice, and I'm trying to organize power to change things. But so I also have to step back and say, Chris, you can create moments of respite for people where they are loved, where they have dignity and respect, even if it's just for a moment. So the only way I can even move forward doing this work is knowing that like the person that walks out after outreach, they very well might die. They might become incarcerated. They might have their kids taken away. Horrific things might happen. And what I can do is in that moment, I can just offer them love that would otherwise not have been there. So I think that you're right. These small things, I need to focus on the now and the small things, but keep in mind this bigger picture. We have to sometime go upstream maybe and find out what the root causes of these are. And I think you were right with this lack of connection and lack of understanding of our emotions and lack of ability to experience authentic emotions are at the root of it.
Yeah, and we live in a society, right, where you see LeBron James winning a championship, but you don't see the hours and hours that he put in behind it, right? So yeah, he's a champion, but he puts so much time and energy in behind that, and kids grow up and we don't see that. We just see the highlights. Turn on ESPN and you see somebody put up so many points on their or whatever the case may be. Hollywood actors and actresses, your musician friends, and so we gauge that. With our own lives, we don't have this kind of success. We're not really putting in that kind of work. And
even worse, sometimes I will judge my internal life to other people's external life. So again, whether it's the celebrity, like I'm thinking about my own inner turmoil and all that shame, and I'm looking at them, and they, Brad Pitt is so fucking handsome, and he's articulate, and he's like nice and charismatic, and like I'm just this loser who like is having his terrible thoughts, and I can't seem to like really actually do anything.
Yeah.
And so I think Facebook and the social media exacerbates that. Yeah, where again, I'm like looking, I'm like, Brad's living in Florida, man, it's beautiful down there, and I'm living in Arizona, and people don't know, like I cried this morning. I like was brought to the verge of tears just because of some personal things, and it's not all roses like that, and yeah, so I think that's very astute.
And social media actually exacerbates that in two ways, right? So if you just post your happy pictures, that's all everybody sees.
Yeah.
And then you're also criticized because you're just posting your happy pictures. But if you post your shit on Facebook, then everybody's like, well, look at these guys, they're crazy. They're posting you don't putting
all their business out there.
Yeah. So you
looking
can't
for attention.
Which is the microcosm of life, right? You're always going to piss somebody off. Someone that is always not going to like you. Trying to make everybody else happy does nothing but make everyone unhappy. And which is the foundation of awareness and things. So.
Have you listened to much of the Brene Brown stuff? She talks about vulnerability. It's really amazing, and there's so many dangers. So again, for me personally, there's a lot of danger if I am going to make myself vulnerable because of my history. I don't trust people. But really, like I honestly believe what you and I share, what our common link is our shared vulnerability. And we try so hard to hide that from each other. And it's really the thing that links us together and makes us a human beings.
I'd like to touch on that for a second.
Yeah.
You and I didn't get along.
No, no, he didn't.
No.
I,
And this is the first time that we've had a real conversation in our entire lives. We spent years coming out of that same system in the same community and the same circle of friends, living this chaotic lifestyle, trying, and that whole slamming into each other that I was talking about earlier, everybody just trying to do their own thing. But I want people to really understand that we have way more in common than we ever realized, and we just figured that out in the last 60 minutes.
had no idea.
No idea, because everybody's they're trying to hide their flaws. Everybody's putting on their shiny faces. And
100%. Like if you weren't in a place where you could be vulnerable with what's happened to you in your life, you wouldn't be doing this podcast. If I wasn't, I wouldn't be sitting there talking about my things too.
that's
So
right.
it's it's beautiful. It opens up for connection.
Yeah, and I appreciate you. I want you to know that. I'm really glad you joined me today. This was there's a lot of good information here. Before we do that, someone has someone in their life that they believe is using drugs, and I think your word is problematically or chaotically. What kind of advice do you have for someone to approach someone they love or know?
So the typical advice people get right now is you have to practice tough love, right? I mean, that's the common thoughts on it. What you and I have been talking about this whole time is connection and, getting in touch with our emotions and being vulnerable. And tough love doesn't have anything to do with connection. In fact, it's the opposite of connection. So I feel like the advice, while well-meaning, is actually detrimental to the person. So my typical, when people call me, when a mom will call me asking, what should I do about my son? I'll say, you should you should do everything you can to keep them in your life and loved, and open up dialogue that is able to be honest and non-judgmental. So far as it doesn't lead to physical, emotional, or financial problems for you, right? And everybody's going to have different boundaries for that. What I see all too often is that people will say, I'm cutting them off. And they're not cutting them off because they can't afford it anymore. They're cutting them off because they hope if they cut them off that they'll finally hit bottom, and then they'll stop, right? And if I could just help them hit bottom, then they'll stop. Well, bottom in the age of fentanyl and this terrible overdose is too often death. And nobody ever recovers from death.
That's right.
I mean, well, we have some religious traditions that would beg to differ, but it's very rare to recover from death, right?
Right.
So my message would be...
It's not an experiment that I want to experiment with.
No. My message would be that we need to kick the love up a notch, and it's hard. And I'm not dismissing the difficulties and the pain and the suffering and the confusion that comes when you're living with someone in chaotic drug use in your life.
Yeah.
At all. But what I am saying is that there's so much misunderstanding and internal shame that we need to do our best, better than our best, to make sure that people understand that even though we don't agree with the way they're living, we still accept that it's happening. So I can accept that it is happening the way it is without condoning it, right? I can see people doing things that I wouldn't necessarily prescribe for them, and still walk with them, despite the fact that they're doing things that I seem. So that's, in general, in essence, it's just meeting people where they are, and opening up that opportunity for conversations about where they are, not leaving them there, but also not like forcing them to be somewhere there. And again, when it crosses the line of emotional, like you can't do it anymore emotionally, then that's a good time to withdraw. When you just can't do it anymore financially, it's a good time to withdraw. But that's about a person's personal needs, not about trying to get somebody else to act in a certain way.
It's about self-care.
It's about self-care.
Boundaries.
Yeah. And if these families engage in harm reduction, so again, if I say you have to stop using drugs, that's one thing. I've given you one thing you can do. And if I engage in harm reduction, all of a sudden there are thousands of things you can do to start making positive change. And as you said earlier, those small things are a foothold for the next thing, or a foothold for the next first step. and then I can keep on taking steps.
Yeah.
That's a really beautiful thing. A lot of families find a lot of relief in harm reduction. Me, as a person who used drugs, and now as a social service provider or social worker or whatever you want to call me, I find a lot of relief in that, and that there are all these opportunities so that we can, just help people live the best possible lives that they can given their current circumstances.
So how would you define how would you define the difference between helping them and enabling them?
So it's kind of tricky. Often, I want to define kind of what enabling is first.
Okay.
And typically when we're talking about enabling, we're assuming that the person wouldn't be able to continue that behavior if we didn't do what we were doing, right? So I am enabling them. If I withdrew my support or my money or whatever, then they would stop. If you have severe substance use disorder, you are not going to stop.
That's right.
Right? If I don't have a clean needle, I'm going to use a dirty needle. If I don't have money, I'm going to go steal money. If I don't have well, not everyone's going to steal too. I just see it when I do the stigma thing. But
yeah.
So in that sense, I would say that enabling is maybe one of the most dangerous ideas we have floating out there. I think that oftentimes I get accused of enabling people by providing sterile equipment or by giving out naloxone. In fact, there was one study. It wasn't peer reviewed, right? But it basically said that when we give out naloxone, it doesn't decrease drug use. In fact, drug use continues. And it was done by economists. And the way they arrived at that was that the people live. So since they're still alive, they keep using drugs. Brett, I'm not even making this up, right? So that's when we get so myopically focused on, like, you have to abstain from drugs. I would rather you die than continue to use drugs.
Yeah.
I fully accept that what I do enables people. I enable them to not get HIV. I enable them to not have hepatitis C. I enable them to have connection where there is no connection in their life oftentimes. I enable them access to other social services. Most importantly, oftentimes because of the opioid overdose drug, I enable them to breathe, right? And to continue to live. So in that sense, I fully embrace the term enabler, and I want to continue and expand my enabling.
And my question was more geared towards someone who may have a loved one. If someone's people are going to worry about the difference between tough love and judgment, and the difference between enabling and harm reduction. And I would think that it's probably situational to a certain degree. I'm sure there's some harder lines there, but I'm sure it's a very fine line in any respect with someone who's dealing with that. Most people will automatically assume giving a heroin addict clean needles is enabling. And you just explained very eloquently how it's not. But I can see how a parent of an addict would be like, there's no way I'm going to give them clean needles.
Right.
Which really isn't their job. That's for someone like you. So I was just trying to help define it for the people who may be listening, who are battling with this kind of, I don't want to enable them, but I do.
Yeah, what I usually say, so I remember talking to my dear friend Sheila on the phone. She was distraught over what to do about her son. And I just reminded her, if you give him $20 and he goes and buys dope and overdoses, that is not because you gave him the $20. If you don't give him the $20, basically what I said to her was like, if you give him the $20, it's not going to kill him. If you don't give him the $20, it's not going to save him. Right? Yeah. Again, this thing is so complicated. If it really is adverse childhood experiences and environment and our different physiological makeups and all these other experiences, all the social determinants that come into it, if it's all those things, then throwing me $20 or letting me stay at the house isn't going to be the thing that makes or breaks me. And that is where it's hard to embrace that kind of like powerlessness, right? That I am not going to fix this person that I love. I cannot love them enough to get them to change their behaviors. And you can't with severe substance use disorder. Again, it has to be internally motivated, but you can do all those other things, like keep them as safe as possible as they go through this journey, and let them know that you love them and that you'll always be there for them as they go through the journey.
One last thing I'd like to say about this, the tough love versus judgment is, be careful. Be careful how you approach them and what you say to them. I once heard a mother plea to her son to stop because of what he was doing to her. And she just kept saying it. Now, I don't want to judge her because I'm not a parent of someone who is using. And so the judgment is not necessarily on her, but the judgment is more in line of what it was doing to him, which I would assume was completely ineffective. It's just adding to the shame that there's no intrinsic motivation there to stop, because I would imagine the childhood was probably part of the problem to some degree. Again, I'm not judging her. I think we've had enough of the conversation. You understand that I'm not, judging the parents for any type of adverse childhood, because everyone's battling their own demons. But
and as you said before, intergenerational trauma is the thing, right?
Yeah.
This goes back 3, 4, 5, multiple generations. So.
Yeah, absolutely. But we have to be what kind of advice do you have for that about with the tough love and the things you should or should not say?
Again, I'm gonna go back to this idea that connection is the opposite of addiction. The antidote for addiction, right, is connection.
Yeah.
So I think that's counterproductive to push people away. Again, unless it's for personal reasons of personal safety, I don't see how that would be effective.
Yeah,
it definitely wouldn't be effective at getting the person to change.
Is what kind of things are appropriate for tough love versus what kinds of things aren't?
I don't think there are tough love appropriateness. So I'm gonna that's why I keep not answering, right? Because I can't think of examples of tough love that would be appropriate, because again, it's tough love has this idea that I'm going to give you tough love and you will see the error of your ways.
Yeah.
And that's not the way substance use disorder works, unfortunately. I wish it was. Hey, if love and frothy emotional appeal and all those things could work, then people wouldn't have their kids removed. We see people all the time who can't stop. They have their kids removed, or they get threatened with going to prison and they still can't stop. So even for self-preservation, people are into grips with this thing that they can't stop doing.
Yeah.
So it's a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah. And I'd like to end with that, in the definition of the substance use disorder, is the inability to control. And I know there's a lot of debate, but this really is a mental condition. And it's a physiological condition. Mm-hmm.
And a social condition, right? Because a lot of these things that for all the ACEs, that doesn't have anything to do with my mind or body. Yeah.
And that inability to control is what you were just talking about. The people they know what's at risk.
Yeah.
And they still make the decision anyway. And so it's not it is just as simple as not doing it, but it's not as simple as not doing it. Boy, that's a conundrum. I don't know what it is.
So it is complicated. That's what I always say. I hope that every time I talk about this, people think, well, that didn't really clarify much. Now it just seems even more complicated. The disorder itself is incredibly complicated. The causes of it are complicated. The treatment for it is complicated. The response to it is going to be as complicated, which again is why I don't share specifically how I escaped chaotic drug use, because what worked for me might not work for the next person. I will say this though, if you have a loved one who is using opioids, the gold standard is either buprenorphine or methadone. So if you want that person to stay alive, if you want them to stay disease-free, stay out of jail, then those are the treatment methods. For other drugs, it's not as cut and dry. But for those drugs, those are the most effective ways to keep our loved ones alive and healthy.
Okay, good information to have. So, Chris, I'm going to ask you if you want to send me some information that I'll put on my blog. And it can be whatever you think would be pertinent to people who are listening. It doesn't matter what it is, but I'll post that on my website so people have it. And again, I want to tell you, I appreciate you. I love the work that you're doing. I had no idea, and I think it's amazing. And I really want to learn more from you about this. So I not only want to do this again, but I'd like to connect outside of this and
Great.
share some information. I think it'd be amazing.
And maybe I'll come down and visit Joey, and we can all hang out down in Florida.
Okay.
I don't know how far away from him you are.
Just it's about an hour drive, not too far at all.
Yeah, he's invited me like 5,000 times. So.
Yeah, that'd be cool. And it gives me excuse. Are you near? I don't know where you're at in Arizona. Are you near Sedona?
I'm in Phoenix, so I'm about an hour and a half away from Sedona.
Okay. I have some friends in Phoenix and friends in Sedona, and
yeah, it's beautiful up there. Like knock the air out of you. Beautiful.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. So, all right, my friend, I appreciate it. It was a great discussion. I'm looking forward to have you back again.
I'd love to come back.
Cool, man. I appreciate it. I
appreciate this is great, Brad. I'm really glad we did this. Thanks.
And so I'm glad you agreed to do it, and I'm going to thank Dave again that he connected us, and let's keep in touch.
I like that.
Okay, I'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Bye, Brad.
Hello? Is anyone here? Hello? Oh, hi. There you are. I've been looking all over for you. I want to thank you for listening today. I also want to tell you, if you haven't checked out my website lately, you should do that. It's www.thebradleyhall.com. Just to remind you, I am a holistic life coach, a certified mindfulness instructor, and I am a trauma recovery coach. And in these uncertain times, sometimes we just need someone to talk to help us clear our thoughts, help us organize our thoughts, and help us map out a clear direction of where we want to go to help us navigate through the obstacles that we may encounter through daily life. And I'm here to do that for you. So check out my website. I've got plenty of free content on my website, also on my YouTube channel, which is The Bradley Hall, and The Health Preacher. And I'd love to hear from you. So thanks again for listening. We appreciate your support. And until then, take care of yourself.